saw from President Biden's request, the top line was $842 billion. Let me say that number again, $842 billion.
Right.
It's larger than the one he proposed last year. It's larger than Congress took his budget last year and put $40 billion on top of that request. It's larger than that, too.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by defense reporter Mike Brest. Mike, the new defense budget is out. President Biden has released his budget. Talk a little bit about what defense spending priorities the president has for the next fiscal year.
So I think it's important to also look at the top line. We saw from President Biden's request, the top line was $842 billion. Let me say that number again, $842 billion.
Right.
It's larger than the one he proposed last year. It's larger than Congress took his budget last year and put $40 billion on top of that request. It's larger than that, too. When you look 2 years ago at the budget that was enacted, it's almost $100 billion more. So the budget continues to go up, but in terms of priorities, through the limited details that we've seen thus far, it does look like the Biden administration and the Department of Defense wants to prioritize the Asia Pacific. Now that makes sense given sort of as we look at the geopolitical status. We see China. We've seen tensions between the U.S. and China, specifically in the last couple of weeks, worsen. We've seen tensions increase, and so the budget looks like it's going to reflect sort of the prevailing thought among defense professionals or officials that tension with China is increasing.
So you mentioned the tension with China. There's been some testimony on Capitol Hill where intelligence officials in the Biden administration have kind of said somewhat contradictory things about how concerned they are about Chinese intentions in Taiwan. But there is at least some level of concern that China may have some ambitions in Taiwan.
Absolutely. So it's important to know that we've heard from a number of different defense officials and even officials of the intelligence community. And so all of them have, somewhat different or slightly different perspectives, but all generally have the same tenor. And it's the prevailing narrative among these officials that China is preparing to invade Taiwan, but is not decided to yet.
Right.
And so Chinese leader Xi Jinping has publicly said he wants the military ready by 2027 to invade. U.S. officials say that is not a certainty, that even though he said that it will happen. To DoD officials, they say it's sort of a target or a goal for them to be ready to do that. But we've heard these officials also say that when China looks at the way Russia's war in Ukraine has gone, they've actually, likely started to question whether or not they're really prepared to undertake such an invasion, especially given the way the U.S. and the West has rallied behind Ukraine and stood in support and continued to arm them throughout more than now a year of the conflict. And so we really have heard some interesting perspectives from intelligence and defense officials in that China is willing to and is prepared to use military force for reunification, but they're not quite necessarily ready to do that right now, is sort of the prevailing theory from them.
So China and Taiwan aren't really the only subjects of congressional testimony. The new Republican House majority has undertaken an investigation of President Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan, the 20-year war, America's longest war. What are some of the takeaways from that testimony?
So the first hearing, again, this was the first hearing the House Foreign Affairs Committee conducted it. There were a number of witnesses. Two of them were service members who were on the ground at Abbey Gate during the evacuation as the U.S. military and NATO forces were evacuating Afghans and Afghan allies at Hamid Karzai International Airport on the flights that we saw famously take off amid chaos on the ground.
Right.
And so there were two service members who testified. One of them is a Marine who says he saw...
These were survivors of the bombing at the airport.
Exactly. One of the Marine who testified said he saw the bomber or someone who he believes to be the bomber, someone who fit the descriptions that he had been given, and that they were not given the green light to shoot. And then ultimately this individual disappeared in the crowd. He was asked point blank if he believes that this individual was ultimately the person who was the bomber, and he said yes. And so there was very powerful testimony from him and from all of the people who were testifying, but it really stood, it provided a lot of narrative on the feelings that veterans are having as they had to relive a lot of painful memories with the way the war ended.
And he had some fairly strong words for how the withdrawal was handled.
Absolutely. So both he and another service member who at the time was a medic who was at the airport said they considered the withdrawal a failure. And they thought there was a lack of accountability with what's happened. As you mentioned, the bombing, 13 service members were killed, about 170 Afghans were killed in it as well. And these were all people, at least the civilians who were killed, who were pleading at the gates at Abbey Gate for service members to pull them over, to let them in so they could have a chance at a new life outside of Afghanistan, where they were afraid for their lives under a Taliban regime.
Because I mean, one of the big criticisms of how the withdrawal was conducted is that a lot of people who'd been involved in the U.S. war effort over 2 decades were left behind.
Absolutely. And so we also heard from people who were involved with the groups of veterans who came together in the final weeks of the U.S. military's time in Afghanistan, who actually helped evacuate people who had, their own personal friends who they worked with when they were in Afghanistan, reach out to them, ask them for help. And through a number of different groups, they were able to navigate and get these people to the service members at the gates of the airport. And so a lot of these individuals talked about the raw emotions, the distraught, how impactful those feelings were because they weren't able to get everyone out that they wanted to.
So in Ukraine, major Russian offensive, there's a real battle going on for the city of Bakhmut. What can you tell us about the state of play there?
So the fighting in Bakhmut has been going on for a number of months now, and it really has been both a war of attrition and a slow ground battle. And so Russia has very slowly taken over bits and pieces of the city, but at the same time they've incurred significant cost. We've seen reports that for every 1 Ukrainian soldier killed in Bakhmut, there are 5 Russians killed. And so even if they do ultimately capture Bakhmut, it will be at a very high cost for them. That being said, getting and capturing Bakhmut does allow them easier access to other parts of the Donetsk region, which is one area that they have already illegally annexed. And so it really is not necessarily a city that will give them a lot of, is not a strategic city considering their overall goals, but it would help them in their offensive moving forward in the near term.
And so Russian mercenaries are playing a pretty big role in this battle, are they not?
Absolutely. The Wagner Group is actually sort of leading the charge here in Bakhmut, and so we've seen and we've heard pretty horrific tactics that the Wagner Group is willing to employ, whether it's here or in a number of various African nations that they've been known to work in. And so we've really seen some strong losses, but we've also seen some conflict between the Wagner Group founder, Yevgeny Prigozhin, and the Russian Ministry of Defense as well.
And he's become pretty publicly outspoken.
Absolutely. It's been one of the subplots to the recent fighting in Bakhmut is the increasingly public dispute between Prigozhin and top leaders in the Russian Ministry of Defense.
Thank you, Mike. You can read Mike and the rest of our national security team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.